All right, welcome back. So when we last left off, we had set up the IK foot controls and pole vectors, set up all the different things like the foot rolls, etc., the toe taps, and all this stuff. Okay, so we have the IK side of our leg rig completed. Now what we need to do is work on the FK side. So first thing I'm going to do, I need to hide all this stuff so that it's not in the way while I work on the FK side. So I'm just going to select all these control buffers, Control H to hide them. I need to select my two IK joint chains here. I'm going to go in the outliner and hit F, and there they are right there. I'm just going to hit Control H to hide those, and then I'm going to select my FK hips and bring those in, and now I have a clean scene with the FK joint chains for me to begin the setup process. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is need to create a control for the legs, and we're going to duplicate this control a bunch of times. Now usually what I'll do is I'll start out with a nerve circle, and I'm just going to go to let's see, nerves primitives, and turn off interactive creation if it's on. That way when I click on that, it's just going to pop a circle down at the origin. Okay, so now what I can do is grab that, hold down V, and snap it to my left hip. And I'm going to bring my character in just so I can set the size of this thing. I'm going to scale it down just a little bit so that it's a size that I can deal with. Okay, so we'll say that we like that size there. The next thing I want to do is duplicate it again. Duplicate, hold down V and snap it to the knee, and again bring back the character. Just make sure that it's at a good size where I can still grab it. Okay, then we're going to go down to the ankle, Control D, get in your move tool, hold V, snap it to that ankle joint. Let us bring this back. That should be a good size. And then the last one, Control D, hold down V and snap it to the ball joint, the ball joint. So I'm just going to scale this one here. When it gets oriented to the joint, it's going to be sort of going in and up and down. So it should be a good enough size, something like that. Okay, so that is what we have for the controls for this side. So what I'm going to do is, because these are left side controls, and if I bring back my left and right foot control buffers just to remember the colors, so remember that the left side is red, so I'm going to go select that control, go in the attribute editor, go in the shape node, object display, drawing overrides, enable overrides, and go find that red, which is right there, and just do the same for all of these. I should have probably done this before I duplicated them, but that's a lesson learned, I guess. So red and red, where is it? There. Okay, so we got them all nice and red. What I'm going to do is name them. So I'm going to hide my IK controls again, so I'm going to name them. This one is left hip control, left knee control, left ankle control, and left ball control. Okay, what we have to do is I'm just going to select all of them, and I'm going to freeze my transformations. I'm just going to use a shortcut right here. Otherwise you can go to modify, freeze transformations to zero out all the values in those controls. Now to duplicate them and mirror them over to the right side, there's a little trick that I like to use. If they're all selected like this and you hit Control G, it's going to put them in a group, and you'll see that the group's pivot is at the origin, which is the center line of the character. So then if I duplicate that group and put a -1 in the scale X, you'll see that it will automatically mirror them over. Okay, and then for all these, I'm going to select all the right side ones, which are also called left in the naming convention. I'm going to go to modify, search and replace names. Look, I'm going to tell it to search for L underscore, replace it with R underscore, and hit replace. So now these are right, so I can then select these and shift P to get them out of those groups, select these, shift P to get them out of these groups, and then the right side ones need their transformations frozen as well. Okay, so we have the left side and the right side, and we can now delete these. Now of course the right side ones need to be the right color, so let's go ahead and go in the shape node here and switch them to that green there, ankle there, ball there, and knee. Oh, did I get the wrong color for the ankle? Or the ball, I guess. Yep. There we go. And knee. There. So that's what we have. So I'm just going to rearrange these so that we have hip, knee, ankle, ball. I did not have them that arranged that way. So hip, knee, ankle, and ball on the left side, and then on the right side, hip, knee, ankle, and ball. Just makes it easier for me to see what's going on. So let's see. All right, so now we have our controls where we want them. Okay, now the issue here, the first thing that we got to do is align these controls to the joints that they're going to be controlling. That's just something that I like to do. I guess it's not really that important to do, but I like to do it. So the easy way to do that is to, if we select our joints here, remember that my move tool, let me go double click my move tool, make sure that my axis orientation is set to object. Okay, that is important because that allows us to see the direction of the axis, how this joint is oriented. So we can see that the joint is oriented with the Y going out the side, the Z going forward, and the X pointing to the child joint. And it's like that all the way down the chain. Okay, so the X-axis is going down the joint. But if you look at the control, you see that the X-axis, the red one for the control, is going out the side of the control. So if I select my joint here and then select my control second and go to, let me make sure I'm in my rigging menu set here, and then go to constrain and orient, making sure that I reset my settings so I'm at my defaults, and add, you'll see that by orienting, that's what an orient constraint does. It's going to try to match up the orientations of the two objects. Okay, the joint, because I selected first, is considered the parent in that relationship, and the control is considered the child. So what happens is it tries to align the child to the parent. And in this case, the parent has its X pointing down this way. So what happens is the control gets rotated, so its X is pointing down this way, its Y out the side, and Z forward. Problem is, that's not exactly how we want this to look, right? We want it to look, we want this to align in such a way. So if I look at this one on this side, so that it's aligned with the joint like that. Okay, so how do we deal with that? If I undo back here, again, if we select our move tool, we know that the X-axis is coming out of the, if we look at this hoop of a control, the X-axis is pointing out the side of the hoop. What we really want is for that X-axis is to be pointing the way that this Y-axis is pointing, and we want it to be running through the hoop of the control. Okay, so the easy way to do that is by simply rotating this 90 degrees, 90 degrees in the Z-axis. And what that does, if I freeze transformations, you'll see that now my X-axis is running through the hoop of the control. So that now when I select my joint and then shift select my control and do a constraint orient, you'll see that now it is orienting exactly the way that I want. Okay, so that's a little trick that you can do. Okay, we wanted that X-axis to be running through the hoop of the control, and in order to do that, we had to turn the control 90 degrees, freeze transformations to reset those axes to world space, and then we were able to align it the way that we want. Now, when I did that, it created a constraint. Okay, you can tell that it's a constraint because it's got light blue check marks on the attributes here, and and orient constraints only work on the rotations of an object. So that's how you know it's an orient constraint, just by looking at it, because it's blue and it only happened on the rotation values. Okay. This orient constraint was just made so that we could align the control to the joint. As it is right now, if I rotate the joint, you'll see that the control is going to go with it. Okay, this is backwards to the relationship, that we want to be able to rotate the control and have the joint go with it. Okay, so this constraint that we just put on here is just there to align the two objects. Now that they're aligned, I can simply open up my hip control here and delete that orient constraint. So now it doesn't have that orient constraint, but it is aligned to that joint. Now you'll see that there's values in here, and we're going to have to find a way to delete those values. I'm just going to delete history on this so I can get rid of some of this stuff. Okay, so we need to do the same for all of these. So I'm just going to take all of these controls here, just select them over here. I'm going to rotate them 90 degrees in Z, like we did. I'm going to freeze transformations. Okay, and then I'm going to go one by one. So I'm going to select my knee joint, knee control, constraint orient. I'm just going to go ankle control, hit G because it's just going to repeat the last command. The ball joint and the ball control, hit G again here, G, G. Make sure you select the joint first and the control second, G, G. Okay, so everything's aligned, but everything needs to have its constraint deleted. So let's just go through, select all of these, and delete those constraints. Now all of these things now have values in them that we need to get rid of. Okay, how do we get rid of this? Remember that controls, when you hand a rig to an animator, the controls should be zeroed out. If I was to say, so if I select my hip control here, if I was to zero out these values, it's just going to put this thing back to the way that it was. Okay, and I don't want that. I want it to be aligned this way, like I have. You see how these are all nicely aligned to their joints? That's what I want. But I also want to have these zeroed out. Okay, so again, this is the alignment of the controls axes right now. If I was to freeze transformations to get rid of those values, look what happened to my axes. Now they do not match up with the joints axes. Okay, and that's going to cause problems for me later. So I need to find a way to get rid of these values while maintaining my axis orientation on the control. How do we do that? Again, just like we did with the IK foot control, we're going to use buffers. Okay, so I'm going to deselect everything, hit Control G. That's going to make a null, which is just an empty group. I need a total of 8 of those, so I'm going to hit Control D 7 times. So let's see. So Control D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's a total of 8. Okay, I'm going to take this one, and I'm just going to double click here, copy the name, and then double click here, paste it, and then put buffer on the end. And I'm just going to go through, copy, paste, buffer, and let's just go ahead and do all of them. Those ankle, ball, buffer, and then let's do the right side as well. So hip, buffer, knee, buffer, and ankle, buffer, and ball, buffer. Okay, so we've named all the buffers as we needed to. So I'm going to take each buffer and snap it to its the same position as its control. So with the hip control buffer selected, I'm just going to snap it to that hip joint. Knee, I'm going to snap to the knee. Ankle, I'm going to snap to the ankle. Ball, I'm going to snap to the ball. The right hip, snap there. Knee there. Ankle there. Ball there. So we'll just go through them make sure that they are where they need to be. I'm going to select all of those, and I'm going to freeze transformations on them just to zero them out. Okay, that's not very important, but I just like to do that. Okay, let's start with the first one. Hip control buffer. Again, the axes on the hip control buffer, as you can see, are aligned to world space. This little gizmo in the corner here is your world space orientation. You can see that that buffer is also aligned to world space because it was created in world space, so naturally it's going to align with world space. So what we have to do is the same thing that we did with the controls, but because the buffer is just an empty group with no shape node, we don't have to do that little trick of rotating at 90 degrees in Z and freezing the transformations. Okay, we can just align it as is. So I'm going to select that hip, control click the hip control buffer, and you're going to have to select the buffers in the outliner, of course, because they don't have anything to grab onto. They're just empty nodes. So again, we're going to constrain orient, and it's going to orient the buffer like that. So let's do it again and go to the knee, hit G. I'm going to select the ankle buffer, hit G. Select the ball buffer, hit G. And let's just keep going. Right ball, hit G. And ankle, G. Knee, and knee, hit G. Hip and hip, hit G. Okay, so again, I'm going to select these, activate my move tool, and just make sure that our alignment is what it's supposed to be. And it looks like it is. And again, we need to open these up and delete all these constraints, because again, all we needed those for was to align things, and we don't need that. Once everything's aligned, we don't need the constraints. So if I select my left hip control here, if you take note of these values in here, and then I'm going to select my hip control buffer, and you'll see that it's got the exact same values in there because it had to be rotated by the same amount to get it to line up. So watch what happens here. Now again, the hip control has these numbers in here. If I take this hip control and put it inside of that buffer, automatically those values disappear. Okay, that hip control is now a child of the hip control buffer. So why did those values now disappear in the hip control? Well, if I select the hip control buffer, what these values here represent is how far offset from world space the rotation values of that buffer are. Okay, when we align that buffer to the joint, it had to be rotated by this much in order to line up with the joint. Okay, so this represents how far away from world space things had to be rotated. And because these objects exist in world space, then they have an offset value from world space. As soon as I parent this hip control curve underneath the buffer, the hip control curve is no longer inside of world space. It is inside the local space of this buffer. Okay, and because they were both oriented the same way in world space, when you put one inside the other, then relative to the buffer, this curve now has no rotations. Okay, does that make sense? Once we get into the buffer, our orientation from world space becomes irrelevant. And because we were both oriented the same way from world space, once one becomes a child of the other, that means it's now zeroed out. Now if I put any rotations on it now, these don't represent an offset from world space. They represent an offset from the parent. Okay, so the parent has offset values from world space. The child has offset values from the parent. Okay, so I'm going to zero this back out. That might seem a little bit confusing, but it is kind of an important concept to understand, is that when you parent something under another, one object under another object, the object that is the child of that relationship then takes on the local space of the parent. okay, then any values that you have inside of the whether it's rotates, scales, or translates, are offsets from where the parent is. They're no longer related to world space. Okay, so we'll do the same thing again. I'm going to take this knee control and put it in the buffer, and again watch how the values go to 0. So then we also want to do ankle to ankle, ball to ball, and you can see all of these zero out. As soon as they get in there, they zero. The buffers, on the other hand, do not get zeroed out because they are still in world space. And that is why we use the buffers, right? We use the buffers to hold all these values. Remember how I said we needed to maintain the orientation of this control while also maintaining the axis relationship between that and the joint. We have done that. The control is now zeroed out. The axes are as we wanted them. That's because we added this buffer. The buffer is now holding those values that used to be on here. It's now holding those values, and that's why we use it. That's why we call it a buffer. It's sort of an insulator from the offsets from world space, so that all these junk values get put in there. They don't get put on the control because the animator wants to get the control with zeroed out values, right? So we want to make sure that we give them that. They don't ever have to manipulate the buffers, so the buffers can be hidden. We don't mess with those, and they hold all these values that we don't want on the controls. Okay, so let's continue hip to hip, and sometimes you'll get these negative zeros, and if you get that, if you just freeze transformations, that'll get rid of that. I'm not really sure what the deal is with those, but it is what it is. So knee, ankle to ankle, and ball to ball. It could be something to do, and it usually only happens on the right side. It could be because I mirrored over controls, and that's just left over from that. But what I'm going to do is just select all the right side controls and freeze transformations on them, and that'll get rid of any negative zeros. Okay, so everything now is aligned the way that we want, and our controls are zeroed out as we want them to be. And now we can go ahead and start actually orienting the joints to the controls. Okay, so and this is why it is of incredible importance to make sure that the joints, if you look at the axis of the joints and the axis of the controls, they're exactly the same. It's very important that you do that, because if you don't, what happens is, so for example, if I were to rotate this way and freeze its transformations, well, actually, no, I'd have to take it out of its group. So if I shift P and then freeze its transformations, okay, so my axes are now back to world space. If I then try to constrain a joint, so I select control first, joint second, you can see that the axes are different. These are pointed this way, and the joints ones are pointed that way. So if I select control first and then joint second and constrain and do an orient constraint, watch what happens to my leg. Okay, because the x-axis of the leg has to match the x-axis of the control, and if the x-axis of the control is off in this direction, then the leg is going to get rotated that way. That's not what we want. So I'm going to undo back to having this in there. So that's back in its group. So now the axes are the same as the joint. So if I select the control and select the joint and constrain orient, you'll see that there's no movement here. Okay, because their axes are aligned, there's no movement. So now I can rotate this, and it's going to take the joint with it, and I'm going to make sure that I do not delete that constraint. Okay, so we're going to go down here, do the same thing, control first, joint second, hit G. It's going to make an orient constraint. Control first, joint second, G, control first, joint second, G, control first, joint second, G, control, joint, G, control, joint, G, control, joint, G. Yeah, get in the habit of using G to repeat a command so you don't have to keep going to the menu for the constraint orient every single time. It's going to speed your workflow up. Okay, so now all these are constrained. So it should work, right? Okay, well, let's see what happens. If I rotate this, look at what happens to my leg. Okay, or if I go down to the knee and rotate that, I get this weirdness. Why is that happening? That's because these controls are staying put as this is being rotated away. So in order to avoid this, what we have to do is create, we want, when I rotate the hip joint, we want all these joints below it, all these when I rotate the hip control, we want all the controls below it to move along with it. Otherwise, we get this sort of broken leg thing here, which is not what we want. Okay, so in order to make all these move with the hip, we need to parent this knee control to the hip control. So I'm going to take my hip control buffer. Sorry, you know what, let's go ahead and start at the ball. I'm going to take my ball control buffer and I'm going to parent it underneath the ankle control. Then I'm going to take my ankle control buffer and parent it underneath the knee control. Then I'm going to take the knee control and parent it underneath the hip control. Okay, so if I open those up, now we have a hierarchy of controls, just like we have a hierarchy of joints, so that when I select my hip control and rotate it, now look at what happens. You'll see that the leg now moves properly. And when I do the knee, same thing. When I do the ankle, takes the ball with it, and I do that, that's what we get. Okay, so I'm just going to undo this back, and that is how we set up an FK leg. So let's do the same for the other side. I'm going to start at the ball buffer and I'm going to put under the ankle control. I'm going to take the ankle control buffer and I'm going to put it under the knee control. I'm going to take the knee control buffer and put it under the hip control. And again, if I open this all up, this is what we should have. Should have buffer control, buffer control, buffer control, buffer control. And if we rotate, again, we get a working FK leg. Okay, so there we go. Those are our FK controls. Now, the issue that you're going to run into, so if this character was to move, you'll see that he's leaving his controls behind, right? We want, when the character moves, we want the controls to go with him, and we're not getting it right now. So there's a little step that we need to take here. Okay, so this is what we're going to have to do. So we want these controls to move. When this pelvis joint moves, we want the controls to go with it. So the easy way to fix this is to parent constrain both buffers, the hip control buffer on the left and the right, to the pelvis joint. So I'm going to select my pelvis joint. I'm going to select control click my left hip control buffer. I'm going to go to constrain and I'm going to use a parent constraint. I'm going to reset it to its default settings and add it. Then I'm going to do the same thing again. Select that pelvis joint, select the right hip control buffer and hit G. So now when I move the character, you'll see that my controls will go with it so that I can use them wherever the character is. Okay, so that's an important step that you want to do. Always make sure that your controls are moving along with the character, otherwise it's not going to work very well. Okay, so that's what we have. The next step, of course, is to do a little bit of cleanup. So select in fact, we can just go ahead and select all these controls on both sides. Okay, we got all the controls selected, and I'm going to hide everything except the rotates. So lock and hide selected. So all of these now just have rotate channels, as you can see. The reason we do that is we don't need the animator having to deal with channels that they're never going to use, right? They're only ever going to rotate these. You can't move them, so there's no point having translates there, and you're not going to scale them up and down, so there's no point having the scale the scale attributes on there. So we want to make sure that we get rid of those. And you know what, I think I have to undo back because I parked my character way back here and I don't remember what the values were in the spine, so I'm just going to and that should be the default position. Okay, so again, I'm just going to select all these controls here. Okay, and then we're going to get rid of translate, scale, and visibility. Right click, lock and hide selected. So they're all they have is rotate, so they can be rotated, but they don't need to be translated, so we're going to get rid of that. Okay, now the buffers themselves, I'm going to go through and select all of these buffers here. Okay, and I'm going to lock and hide everything except visibility. Okay, so lock and hide selected. And the reason why we leave the visibility visible is because when we do our IK/FK switching, we want to be able to have the controls disappear and reappear depending on the mode that I'm in. So I'm going to leave the visibility channels open for now until I connect them, and then once I've connected them, I can lock and hide those channels. Okay, so that is the FK side of our rig, and as you can see, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We're just basically creating controls that do exactly the same thing that the joints do natively. So it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward for that. Okay, so that is the FK side of the rig. So now we have to set up our IK/FK switching. Okay, what we're going to do is make a new control, and that's going to be our IK/FK switching control, and that control will be used to set the legs to one mode or the other. And we're going to make it so that you can sort of blend between, so it's not an on and off switch. It sort of goes from 0 to 1, 0.1, 0.2, etc. So we're going to set that up next.